Her ex-husband mocked her for living modestly after divorce. Then she walked into the gala and, on the surface, Madeline appeared to be one of many quiet women walking through the city every morning, dressed modestly, always with a bag from the local market, and a slight bend to her shoulders. Most wouldn't give her a second glance, assuming she was just a low-level employee or someone who had simply settled into a simple life. Her brown hair was usually pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her clothes, while clean, had clearly seen better days. She carried herself with calm reserve, rarely raising her voice, never boasting, and always seeming to be on her way somewhere small and unimportant. That was the version of Madeline the world saw, and the one her ex-husband, Gregory, loved to dismiss. But beneath her quiet manner and faint smile was a storm of untold thoughts. There was a time she would have spoken more, taken more space, maybe even argued back. That was before the years with Gregory had eroded her confidence. What people didn't know was that Madeline had once been someone full of fire and curiosity, with dreams of building something of her own. Her silence was not from ignorance but exhaustion. She was not weak, she had just learned that sometimes, silence was the only way to survive cruelty in plain sight. She had a past few dared to imagine, and a future no one, not even Gregory, would see coming. The morning Gregory handed her the divorce papers, he didn't even make eye contact. He simply left them on the kitchen table with a pen beside them, as if they were a simple delivery, like a gas bill. He cleared his throat and muttered, "It's for the best," then walked out to take a call from his assistant, laughing, moments later, as if he hadn't just ended a decade-long marriage. The betrayal wasn't in the papers. Madeline had seen it coming for months. The betrayal was in the ease, the indifference, the cruel efficiency of it all. Gregory had moved on before she even realized he'd left emotionally. She signed them that evening, quietly, with hands that trembled but didn't stop. What hurt more than the divorce itself was how quickly everything unraveled. Within a week, Gregory had moved into a new apartment uptown and began posting photos online, luxury dinners, rooftop parties, designer suits. Their mutual friends didn't call. Some even liked his posts. He'd crafted a version of the story in which Madeline had been the unambitious, uninteresting wife who didn't match his growth. He whispered it at networking events, joked about it with colleagues, and even told his new girlfriend, she just didn't evolve. It was like watching someone rewrite your life while you stood on the sidelines, screaming silently. But Madeline didn't scream. She packed her things, kissed her daughter on the forehead, and left. "You'll be begging me for help in 6 months," Gregory had said just before she closed the door behind her for the last time. His voice was cold, smug, certain. "You never built anything of your own. You won't last out there without me." Madeline didn't answer. Not because she didn't have a response, but because she knew he wanted to see her angry, broken, desperate. She wouldn't give him that. As the elevator doors closed between them, she stared ahead, her eyes dry and wide open. She carried 2 suitcases, one filled with her clothes, the other with her daughter Ava's books and toys. That was all she took from their 5-bedroom house in the suburbs. In the months that followed, Gregory's words echoed during the hardest nights. When the rent felt impossible. When the job search led to nothing but dead ends. When Ava asked if they'd ever live in a big house again. But Madeline refused to collapse under the weight of those words. She found a small 2-bedroom apartment near a school with decent reviews. She bought furniture from secondhand shops and took a job as a part-time cashier in a stationery store. The manager barely looked at her resume. "You're overqualified," he said, frowning at her college degree listed at the bottom. "Doesn't matter," she replied. "I just need to work." And so she did, with quiet resolve. Their new home was clean but plain. Beige walls, cheap tiles, and a slight hum in the bathroom light that never stopped. Madeline slept on a fold-out sofa in the living room to give Ava the only bedroom. She decorated it with string lights and stuck glow-in-the-dark stars to the ceiling. "So you can look up at something magical," she told her. Ava missed her old bed, her big window, her dog they had to give away. But she never complained. She saw her mother come home late, take off her shoes in silence, and rub her hands, red and sore from long hours handling stock. Even at 7 years old, Ava understood things had changed in ways too big to explain. Madeline hated the silence of the apartment. Not just the absence of Gregory's voice, but the absence of warmth. There had been laughter once, music playing while she cooked, friends coming over. Now the only sounds were the neighbor's television through the wall and the soft clinking of her daughter's spoon against her cereal bowl. Still, she filled the space with effort, story time every night, small weekend walks, library visits. Slowly, Ava began to smile more. And Madeline, though still tired, began to sleep with a sliver of peace. But every time she walked past a mirror, she could see it, the doubt in her eyes. The question Gregory had planted like poison, "Am I really nothing without him?" It was a small thing at first, a glance held too long by a woman in the cereal aisle. Then came the whispered voice near the frozen food section. "Isn't that Gregory's ex-wife? I heard she's working retail now." Madeline kept her head down, placing items in her cart with steady hands. But inside, she burned. They never said these things when she was hosting dinner parties or volunteering at Ava's school in a designer coat Gregory had picked. Back then, they called her so supportive, the perfect wife. Now, without the car, the house, and the title of Mrs. Gregory Lawton, she had become something pitiful in their eyes, a cautionary tale dressed in flats and a worn-out tote bag. She heard the judgment everywhere, behind smiles, in polite conversations, through social media posts that weren't about her but somehow aimed in her direction. And Gregory didn't help. He spoke freely at functions about how Madeline hadn't wanted to grow with him, how she was comfortable with small things, and how lucky he was to have found someone who matched his ambition. Madeline said nothing. She watched it all from a distance, biting her tongue. Not because she believed them, but because she had no stage of her own yet. But she was watching, learning, and slowly piecing together something no one could see. Something that would speak for her when the time was right. Madeline's second job came through a friend of a friend who owed her a favor. It was at a small architectural firm in Midtown, a receptionist role that paid slightly better than the store. The office was sleek, filled with stainless steel, tall windows, and people who dressed like their shoes cost more than a week of her salary. On her first day, she was shown her desk, handed a packet of procedures, and barely spoken to. Most people passed her with faint nods, if anything. She knew the tone immediately, the kind that whispered, "You're lucky to be here." She had been underestimated before, but this time it came with the sting of being older, recently divorced, and clearly rebuilding. Her supervisor, Talia, a woman in her early 30s with a sharp bob and an even sharper tongue, didn't hide her disdain. "We like people who take initiative," she said with a brittle smile, as if daring Madeline to challenge her. The other assistants were younger, chatting about rooftop brunches and engagement rings while side-eyeing Madeline's thrifted blazer. She kept her head down, focused on learning every detail, calendar systems, preferred vendors, the best coffee orders for the partners. She stayed late, came early, and never complained, even when Talia tossed files on her desk without a word. No one saw her working through lunch, or the quiet way she corrected mistakes that weren't hers. That was fine. She wasn't there to be liked. A month into the job, Madeline was refilling the coffee machine when she overheard her name. Two junior associates were chatting by the copy room. "That's Gregory Lawton's ex, right? I think she used to go to those charity events with him." The other one laughed. "Really? She's just a receptionist now?" They didn't know she was nearby. She didn't let them see her reaction as she carried the coffee pot back to its station. But the sting was sharp, familiar. Once again, her identity was reduced to an asterisk in someone else's story, a footnote under a man's name, his past, his reputation. That night, she walked home with her coat wrapped tight against the wind, her thoughts a swirl of memories she tried hard to shelve. She remembered the dinner parties where Gregory would interrupt her mid-sentence to add a funnier punchline. The vacations where he took photos only of the hotel and never of her. And now, even in his absence, she lived in the shadow of his version of her. But as she turned the key to her apartment, greeted Ava, and helped with homework at their kitchen table, she felt something steadier than rage. Not the urge to correct the record, but the quiet conviction to build her own version, and let time speak for her. Gregory's success was impossible to ignore. His face popped up on business magazines, LinkedIn feeds, and social media posts about real estate summits and power couples at gala events. His new partner, Celeste, was everything Madeline was accused of not being: outspoken, fashionable, ambitious. Celeste posted filtered photos from Paris rooftops and used hashtags like #blessed and #powermoves. Madeline saw them by accident sometimes, while looking up school events or scrolling too late at night when she couldn't sleep. In those moments, she felt like a ghost watching someone else live a life that used to be hers. But something had shifted in her perception. Instead of longing, she began to observe patterns. Gregory always posed at the center of attention, Celeste perfectly angled next to him. His captions always praised her ambition, but never her soul, her ideas, or her warmth. Madeline remembered that emptiness well. She had lived with it. She had smiled through it. Gregory's rise looked flawless on the surface, but she knew that mirror. She had stood before it for years, learning how to see through the cracks. While the world praised him, she was slowly rebuilding from the inside out, where no one was watching, and where it mattered most. Ava was quiet for a week after overhearing a comment at school. "Is your mom poor now?" a classmate had asked during recess. She didn't answer. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table, slowly stirring her soup while Madeline reviewed bills under dim light. Finally, Ava asked, "Mom, are we okay?" Madeline looked up and saw it, the worry, the confusion, the innocence fighting with the reality children shouldn't have to carry. "Yes," she said. "It's hard right now, but we're okay. I promise you that." Ava didn't ask again. But from then on, Madeline noticed her being extra careful with her shoes, always finishing her lunch, and never asking for new toys. That quiet maturity broke Madeline's heart and inspired her at the same time. She began looking for side projects, freelance work, anything that could bring in more income. She researched scholarships, coding courses, business certifications, anything that could move her forward. Each night, after Ava fell asleep, Madeline would sit by the window with a notebook and pen, scribbling plans, lists, dreams. She wasn't sure yet what the final version of her life would be, but she knew this: it had to be one Ava could look at with pride. Not because it looked perfect, but because it was built with dignity, love, and unshakable strength. There was a kind of freedom and frugality that Madeline hadn't expected. It began with necessity, clipping coupons, tracking grocery sales, learning to make soup that lasted 3 days. But over time, it became almost empowering. She no longer had to pretend. No more dinners she couldn't afford. No more hosting events to impress people who never really saw her. Instead, her evenings were quiet, often spent reading with Ava or trying new recipes with whatever was left in the fridge. The world outside chased extravagance. Inside their tiny apartment, Madeline rediscovered simplicity, resilience, and the joy of building something slow but lasting. She took Ava to the library every Saturday. They borrowed books, joined reading hours, and spent hours sitting on sunlit benches sharing stories. On Sundays, they explored city parks, turning nature walks into adventures. Madeline couldn't afford expensive gifts, but she gave Ava something deeper, presence. And in those moments, something began to grow in her. Not just confidence, but clarity. She began to realize that the life Gregory mocked her for, the life he thought was beneath him, was quietly healing her. She didn't need more to be more. She just needed space to become who she truly was, and that journey had finally begun. Madeline had never cared much about fashion, but she used to dress to complement Gregory's presence, tailored dresses, tasteful jewelry, always in neutral colors he said made her look refined. Now, her wardrobe was a mix of consignment finds and hand-me-downs, nothing flashy, everything practical. But strangely, each piece began to feel like armor, not camouflage. The coat with the missing buttons still kept her warm. The faded blouse she wore to her first client call made her look like herself again. Without trying to impress anyone, she had started dressing for survival, and slowly, for self-respect. At the office, her look didn't change much, but her presence did. Talia still barked orders, but Madeline now answered with calm precision, sometimes even correcting her, politely, but with certainty. The partners began noticing. One even commented, "You're more organized than some of our managers." She smiled, said thank you, and kept working. It wasn't about recognition. It was about reclaiming her space, step by step, even if no one applauded her for it. Her strength wasn't loud. It was consistent, and it was starting to speak for itself. One rainy afternoon, Madeline arrived 5 minutes late to pick up Ava. A volunteer at the school gate, a sharply dressed PTA mom named Mrs. Prescott, raised an eyebrow. "We really need parents to be punctual," she said, glancing at Madeline's wet shoes and worn bag. "It sets a poor example for the children." Madeline smiled faintly. "Thank you. I'll do better," she replied, though inside, something twisted. That same woman used to ask her for fundraising advice back when Madeline still had the name and house that earned her respect. Now, with no title or prestige, she was treated like a nuisance. As they walked home under a shared umbrella, Ava looked up and said, "You don't have to let her talk to you like that." Madeline paused. "Sometimes we let people talk so we can hear who they really are," she said. It was the first time she realized her silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was strategy. She was learning who truly saw her, and who only saw what they wanted to believe. The world hadn't changed. Only her place in it had. She was no longer trying to fit. She was choosing where she stood. Weeks later, a white envelope arrived at the firm. It had no return address. Inside was a typed letter addressed to the partners, filled with vague criticisms of Madeline, implying she wasn't fit for front desk duties, that clients had felt awkward due to her background, and that her presence might tarnish the company's image. The letter wasn't signed, but the tone was unmistakable. Talia's voice echoed in every sentence. Madeline read it once, twice, and calmly handed it to HR. She didn't defend herself. She didn't need to. Her track record and daily work spoke louder than any whisper campaign. That afternoon, one of the partners, Mr. Lewin, stopped by her desk. "You're doing excellent work. Ignore distractions," he said before walking away. It was the most direct acknowledgement she had ever received from him. Talia didn't look at her for the rest of the day. But Madeline wasn't interested in revenge. She saw the letter for what it was, desperation from someone who feared being outshined. And that, in its own twisted way, was the first real proof that her quiet rise was beginning to make noise. Late one evening, her old cell phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. On the other end was a man named Mr. Bennett, a retired client from Gregory's firm. "Forgive the call," he said, "but I remembered how gracious you were at that event years ago. I heard from someone you're working again." He explained that he'd started a small foundation focused on educational equity and was looking for someone to help manage donor relations and project logistics. Someone organized, discreet, and sharp. "Like you." Madeline was stunned. She hadn't spoken to anyone from that world in years. "I'd be honored," she said, her voice calm even though her heart raced. It wasn't just a job. It was a bridge to something she thought had vanished, a world she once moved through with ease, now returning not because of her name, but because of her character. It was the first door that opened not with Gregory's key, but with her own. The foundation's office was tucked inside a co-working building downtown, modest but filled with purpose. When Madeline walked in for the first meeting, she wore her best second-hand blazer and the only heels she still owned. Mr. Bennett greeted her warmly and introduced her to the team, a small, diverse group who cared more about ideas than titles. Within minutes, they were talking grants, event planning, and public school partnerships. She spoke with confidence, offering suggestions that surprised even herself. It had been years since she felt this professionally alive. After the meeting, a young assistant whispered, "You're amazing. Are you from consulting or something?" Madeline smiled. "Something like that." She didn't need to explain. The titles didn't matter. The quiet strength she had forged in the margins of her former life was now guiding her into rooms that felt real, purposeful, and new. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was proving herself. She felt like she had already arrived. Weeks into the new role, Mr. Bennett pulled Madeline aside after a team strategy session. "We're expanding," he said. "I want you to lead the next major initiative." She hesitated, unsure if he meant to offer her something that grand. "You've got the mind for this," he added. "You listen, you plan, and you execute. I see the way people lean in when you speak." It had been a long time since anyone spoke of her with such trust. Even longer since she believed it. She took a breath, then nodded. "Yes," she said. "I'd love to." It wasn't a proposal of romance, but of purpose, and that meant more to her now. That evening, Madeline stood by her apartment window watching the city lights flicker. She thought of how different this felt from the life she once shared with Gregory. That world had been full of appearances, of playing parts. But this was different. She wasn't being handed something for her looks or connections. She was being trusted with responsibility because she had earned it. She closed her eyes and let the moment settle. A different kind of future was beginning to take shape, one built from her own vision. The initiative focused on mentorship for young girls in underserved schools, offering resources, guidance, and exposure to paths they might not otherwise see. Madeline threw herself into the work, connecting with educators, speaking with students, designing programs that prioritized voice over charity. "It's not about saving anyone," she told the team. "It's about showing them what they already have, and what they deserve. Her words resonated. Within weeks, enrollment in the pilot program doubled. Madeline found herself giving presentations, attending city meetings, and being introduced as the project lead. And yet, outside those spaces, she still lived modestly, commuting by subway, packing her own lunch, using the same worn bag. The contrast was striking, but she found power in that balance. She didn't need approval to feel valuable. The work gave her peace. Ava, now more confident in school, began telling her friends, "My mom helps people." Those words were worth more than any applause. Madeline had once said yes to survival. Now, she was saying yes to impact, and it made all the difference. As the project grew, Madeline began networking with city leaders, nonprofits, and local entrepreneurs. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing the culture of power without losing herself to it. At one event, she spotted Celeste across the room, Gregory's partner, dressed in a glittering gown, surrounded by cameras. Madeline remained unnoticed, seated beside an education official discussing district funding. She didn't need a spotlight to feel relevant. She was part of something bigger than vanity. Something lasting. Behind the scenes, she was orchestrating partnerships that would benefit thousands of students, often while others underestimated her. Some saw her as just the admin until they watched her lead a conversation, present a budget, or redirect an entire committee. These weren't performances. They were decisions. And for the first time, her power didn't come from being adjacent to someone important. It came from being deeply necessary in her own right. Ironically, just as Madeline was rising, whispers from Gregory's circle returned. A former acquaintance messaged her saying, "There's talk going around. Gregory says you begged for help after the divorce." Madeline felt the old nausea return, that sense of being pulled back into a version of the story she didn't write. But she didn't respond. There was nothing to defend. The truth didn't need her protection anymore. It had grown beyond words, it lived in actions, relationships, and impact. And for those who needed proof, they could look at the results she had created. Still, it amazed her how confidently people spoke of her as if they knew her journey. She lives off grants now. She was lucky someone took pity on her. She never really worked before. These comments trickled through mutual connections. But she let them fall like rain on pavement, heard, but harmless. Because for every lie spoken, there was a girl in a classroom learning how to own her voice because Madeline helped open the door. That was the only narrative that mattered now. One Saturday morning, Madeline stopped by the stationery store where she used to work. She needed supplies for an upcoming workshop. The same young cashier greeted her with a surprised smile. "You look different," he said. She chuckled. "I feel different." Behind her, a woman whispered to a friend, "Isn't that Gregory Lawton's ex? She used to stock shelves here, right?" The comment didn't sting this time. In fact, it almost made her smile. The story they remembered was outdated. And it no longer defined her. As she left the store, she thought of how far she had come. Not in distance, but in self-worth. She had once cried on her walk home from that place, wondering if she would ever feel like herself again. Now, she walked taller. The same hands that had folded invoices were now signing contracts. The same voice that once apologized for everything now led rooms into action. And that store? It wasn't a symbol of shame anymore. It was where the real story began. The ivory envelope arrived unexpectedly, addressed in cursive and bearing the emblem of the Langford Foundation, a name Gregory proudly associated with for years. It was an invitation to their annual gala, the most exclusive philanthropic event of the season. Madeline stared at it for a long time. She hadn't attended anything like that since before the divorce. She had no designer gown, no status entourage, no one expecting her to show up. But something in her stilled as she folded the invitation and placed it gently on the table. She wasn't going to attend to prove anything. She was going because she belonged in rooms like that, maybe more now than ever before. When she told Mr. Bennett about the gala, he simply said, "You should go. Represent us." The foundation had recently been shortlisted for a city partnership, and appearances mattered. "I'll find something appropriate," she nodded. She didn't say that the last gown she wore to such an event had been chosen by Gregory, tailored to his tastes, not hers. This time, she would wear what made her feel powerful. She didn't need sequins. She needed truth. That was what she would bring into the room, unspoken, but unmistakable. The gala was held at a downtown hotel ballroom lined with chandeliers and tall vases of white orchids. Madeline entered quietly, dressed in a simple navy gown borrowed from a friend and heels she hadn't worn in years. Heads didn't turn immediately. There was no grand announcement, no spotlight. She registered at the table, thanked the attendant, and made her way toward the networking space where nonprofit leaders gathered near the stage. Conversations filled the room like soft static, and a string quartet played in the distance. She was no longer the woman who had to pretend she knew what to say. She was ready to listen, speak, and be heard. Across the room, someone did notice Gregory. He was standing near the bar, drink in hand, laughing with a small group. When his eyes landed on her, something in his expression faltered. He hadn't seen her in years, and certainly not like this. Not composed, confident, surrounded by influential people who clearly valued her presence. Celeste leaned in, whispering something, then turning to glance too. But Madeline didn't flinch. She looked past them as if they were just another part of the decor. She wasn't there for memories. She was there for movement. An hour into the event, Gregory made his way across the room, flanked by two donors. Madeline was speaking with a deputy from the mayor's office when she heard him behind her. Well, I didn't realize they were letting just anyone in tonight," he said, laughter tucked behind his words. The deputy raised an eyebrow, confused. Madeline turned calmly. "Actually," she replied, "I'm here representing the Bennett Foundation. We're in talks with the Department of Education." The expression on Gregory's face shifted just enough to reveal what he tried to hide, a flicker of surprise, maybe even panic. "Oh," he said flatly, then forced a smile. "Good for you. Nice recovery." The word stung. Not because it was cruel, but because it showed he still believed she was someone who had fallen. Madeline didn't respond to the jab. She simply turned back to her conversation, as if his presence was irrelevant. And for the first time, it was. Gregory's laughter no longer echoed in her mind. It dissolved in the air around them, meaningless and small. Later that evening, during the program segment, Madeline's name was called. "Please welcome Madeline Green, Director of Youth Programs at the Bennett Foundation, to share a few words." A spotlight followed her to the podium. She walked calmly, every step steady. On stage, she didn't start with grand statements. She began with a story, a girl from a broken home who believed her future ended the day her parents split. A girl who, through mentorship, found a path to college. That girl, she said, pausing, now mentors others. And she's here tonight, working beside me. The room fell silent. Her voice, while soft, carried weight. We don't save people, she concluded. We remind them of their power. Applause rose slowly, then grew. Gregory sat stiffly in the crowd, jaw tense. For once, the room was no longer leaning toward him. The spotlight had moved, and it wasn't coming back. Madeline stepped down from the stage not as someone's ex, but as someone entirely her own. After her speech, people began approaching her. Donors, educators, board members, faces she had only seen in magazines or meeting minutes. We should talk, one said. Your words moved me, said another. But the most startling reaction came from a couple near the exit. Is that her? The woman whispered to her husband, eyes wide. I think so. That's Gregory's ex-wife. Didn't she disappear after the divorce? Her voice wasn't mocking, just baffled. As if she were seeing a ghost, or someone reborn. Madeline heard it, but didn't stop walking. She didn't need to explain herself. Her presence was explanation enough. She had become what few expected, a woman who didn't collapse after being cast aside. She didn't rebuild her life to prove them wrong. She did it to feel right again, within herself. And now, they would see her, not because she demanded it, but because it was impossible not to. As the evening neared its end, the foundation's chairman took the stage to thank key contributors. When he mentioned Madeline's name again, this time as the architect of their fastest-growing youth program, murmurs spread through the audience. She built that entire initiative, he said, gesturing toward a slideshow that showcased smiling students and classrooms transformed through mentorship. The applause came louder this time, filled with real admiration, not charity, not politeness, but earned respect. Madeline sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, letting the moment happen without fanfare. Among the murmurs, a few voices grew louder. Wait, that's the woman Gregory used to be married to, someone whispered. Didn't he say she couldn't handle work? Another voice followed, looks like she's doing more than just handling it. Madeline heard none of it directly, but she could feel the shift in the room. What once was gossip had turned into curiosity, and curiosity into reevaluation. She hadn't just reappeared. She had returned on her own terms, wearing dignity like armor and impact like a crown. Celeste stood by the refreshment table, nervously stirring her untouched drink. She had always believed Gregory's version of events, that Madeline was fragile, uninspired, incapable of thriving outside his orbit. But now, here she was, commanding the attention of people who used to ignore her. Celeste watched as donors leaned in to listen, as journalists scribbled notes, as staff sought her input. It didn't make sense. This wasn't the woman Gregory described during their champagne brunches and late-night rants. Gregory remained near the back, jaw tight, his drink untouched. The recognition he expected that night had been swallowed by a force he hadn't seen coming. Madeline didn't gloat. She didn't look his way, didn't make a scene. That made it worse. The quiet nature of her ascent was like an echo in a room where he no longer mattered. The more she stayed composed, the more their past version of her unraveled. People were no longer laughing at the story he'd told. They were questioning why they believed it in the first place. Toward the end of the evening, one of the donors Gregory had introduced earlier approached Madeline directly. I didn't realize you were the one behind the Bennett Youth Program, he said with an embarrassed smile. I met Gregory a few months ago. He spoke of you differently. Madeline met his gaze with grace. People speak from the version of the truth they're most comfortable with, she replied. It wasn't defensive. It was matter of fact. The man nodded slowly, visibly uncomfortable. Well, I'd love to discuss collaboration, he added, trying to recover. We could use someone with your clarity. Gregory stood nearby, having overheard the exchange. For the first time, he understood the consequences of the story he'd told. It hadn't ruined her. It had revealed him. He had tried to make her small, but in doing so, he had only made his own shadow darker. Now the room he once owned was filled with her voice, her work, her influence. And he couldn't take any of it back. Not with an apology, not with charm, not even with money. That silence, the one after his reputation cracked, was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. As the final speech concluded and guests began to leave, Madeline retrieved her coat and thanked the staff. Ava was at home with a sitter, likely asleep by now. She'd tell her daughter about the evening in the morning, not the glitz, but the meaning. As she reached the exit, Gregory stepped forward, blocking her path for a moment. Madeline, he said, his voice tight, you've changed. She paused, met his eyes, then gave a polite smile. No, she replied softly. I just stopped shrinking. Then she walked past him, leaving behind not just the ballroom but the years of silence she once wrapped around herself like a safety blanket. She had no interest in revenge. The moment had already given her what she needed, a closing that didn't require a confrontation. She didn't need to win the room. She just needed to leave it standing tall. And she did. The next morning, Ava was already up, dressed, and seated at the table with her notebook open. How was the gala? She asked, eyes shining. Madeline poured her coffee and sat across from her. It was honest, she said with a smile. I spoke. People listened. And they saw me. Ava grinned. I knew they would. For a moment, they just sat there, the city rising outside their window, quiet but full of promise. It wasn't the house with the tall fence, or the pool, or the expensive tiles. It was something far better, a place filled with truth. Madeline had once feared that she'd never feel whole again without someone beside her to validate her existence. Now, sitting across from the only person whose opinion truly mattered, she felt more than whole. She felt free. And in Ava's proud gaze, she saw everything she had fought for. Not revenge. Not redemption. But restoration. Quiet. Steady. Unshakable. And finally, complete.